I'm going to say a few things about accountability, which is another word that we use a lot in the decentralization world, and sometimes we don't really understand what it means, or we're using it in partial ways that make sense to us. But it's a relatively, on the one hand, the principles are simple, but getting accountability right in a particular instance of decentralization can be rather difficult. So there's three major types of accountability that we have to be aware of. One is the one that we usually think about, which is downward accountability to citizens, because when you have decentralization, basically what's happening is that responsibility for certain functions is being devolved to local governments, and they're now answerable to the citizens who elect them. So this downward accountability to citizen voters through elections and other means is the first part. The other part that we know very well is upward accountability. Now, of course, under decentralization, you're reducing upward accountability. There has to be, if you're going to have genuine decentralization, some shift away from the emphasis in a centralized system on accountability of local administrators and entities upwards to the central government, and a movement towards more downward accountability. And of course, again, these balances can differ in different contexts. But this is something that needs to be considered. And the third element of accountability, which we talk about but sometimes don't fully appreciate the implications of, is the horizontal accountability between elected councils and the staff who actually execute the functions of local governments. So under decentralization, of course, these staff would now be reporting to the elected local councils and not upwards to the ministry and the sector in which they work. And this is fundamentally critical, because if the elected local councils, who are supposed to be more accountable downward to their citizens in pursuit of the benefits of decentralization, can't control the staff who are delivering the services that are being demanded by their constituents, you have an accountability problem. And this is often a problem in developing countries, because not infrequently the staff of new local governments in newly decentralizing systems were formerly staff of central government ministries, or perhaps in federal systems, state government ministries. And if they continue to look upward for direction to their parent ministries for whom they formerly worked, you aren't going to, the elected local councilors are not going to be able to provide the kind of direction from citizens which is so critical for attaining the benefits of decentralization. So this implies that elected local councils have to have some control over the hiring and firing of staff. If things that citizens are demanding are not being delivered because of bad performance by staff, the council has to be able to discipline those staff and replace them if necessary, and bring in other people. Now, there are many complications in a developing country environment. Do local governments actually have the capacity to do this kind of management? But this is why we have civil service frameworks and so forth, which provide a set of rules and standards and things like that, which help to provide guidance, just as we have standards for budgeting, even though the decisions about what the budget is going to be spent on should rest with the elected local authorities and not with the central government ministries. So again, just to summarize, under decentralization, these accountability relationships change. There's always going to be a need for upward accountability to certain degrees, but it's simply necessary that there be a shift towards more emphasis on downward accountability, because that's required for the benefits of decentralization to be realized. And unless there's this horizontal accountability relationships in which the councils have some control over the staff, then they may not be able to respond to their constituents, and the locus of accountability may remain too far on the upward side and not enough on the downward side. So these things are going to change over time. In early stages, you might have a continued higher amount of upward accountability and monitoring, and then as local governments prove themselves and citizens come to trust them, you can move in the direction. So it's not that there's an absolute balance that must always be there. The balance can evolve, and it depends on the context in a particular case. But one other really important aspect of accountability, which I think often does get neglected, is the spatial dimension of accountability, because there are often there are questions about what's the right size of local governments in order to be able to achieve the benefits of decentralization. And one thing we know for sure is that bigger local governments tend to be more fiscally viable. They're better able to raise resources, to be able to have on staff the kinds of people who are going to be able to manage resources better, and so forth. But we also know that smaller local governments tend to have greater political connectivity to their citizens. So we're often searching for the right balance between a local government that's big enough to be able to be fiscally viable, to achieve economies of scale in service delivery, and so forth, that smaller local governments can't. Now, there are many ways of doing this. You can have different levels of government that where smaller local governments have more modest functions and operate with some degree of autonomy. And you can also have multiple tiers of government. You might have, for example, sub-mayoralities or smaller local governments within a larger local government, and large network infrastructure is provided by the higher level, but each of these sub-mayoralities or subdivisions gets a small amount of resources that they can exercise autonomy over and provide things that their citizens directly want. But if local governments are too small, you don't want to give them responsibility for large functions. And we run into these kinds of problems, of course, particularly in urban areas, where sometimes in metropolitan areas you have a lot of independent local governments that are right next to each other, and they have to solve the problem of how you get a good road network that goes across all of these independent local governments. So just again, to summarize this, there's a spatial dimension to accountability, which has to do with we have to think about in terms of the number and size of jurisdictions, and the possibility that there may be layering of levels in which responsibilities are shared in a way that maintains political connectivity to citizens, but also provides the right amount of scale for services to be provided efficiently over larger areas.